So in this video, we're going to review weekly events in Ukraine, starting with last week. That's Monday, the 6th of November. If you don't know me, my name is Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to help you understand context and how to think about what's going on in Ukraine. Okay, so Monday, November 6th, there are only a few things that were really important. And I go through the headlines and then I amplify some of the headlines so that you can understand maybe some more context. On Monday the 6th, Ukraine defense industry confirms mass production of Ukrainian long-range drones. This is excellent. If they can do this and do this well, they can threaten Russia in so many ways because Russia's a big place and they only have so much air defense to go around. And so because it's such a big place, so spread out, they can attack all kinds of different directions, and that will make the Russians have to back up and use their air defense to protect Mother Russia rather than to be in Ukraine, which will make it easier for them to be able to prosecute the war in Ukraine. Explosions and fire engulf a Russian ammo depot in occupied Ukrainian village. I talked about that in the previous video. Aide to Ukraine commander-in-chief was killed in an explosion during a birthday celebration. So we initially thought this was the Russians. The story came out a little bit later that it was perhaps some kind of human error. There was a grenade that was given as a gift, and it turned out to be a live grenade, and the thing was pulled. We don't know if he might have been drunk and pulled it, or it was accidentally pulled, or whatever, but apparently it went off. It initially looked, again, like it was some kind of Russian sabotage, but the story, the official story at least, and I can't speculate about something more than the official story, was that it was an accident. Okay, but we didn't know that on Monday. Tuesday, November 7th, people who don't believe in victory have no place in command, says Danilov. I mean, that's just true. Like, if you're not like 100% committed to, like, we're going to prosecute this war and win, like, we don't need double-minded leaders, and that's actually a really good way of processing and thinking about this if you're on that level. Technically, Russia has already won in Ukraine, says Pravda, Russia's Pravda. And of course, they come up with these kind of stories like all the time. Another story, Russia's growing list of naval losses. This was in Radio Free Europe, and it was actually a really interesting thing. Without a navy, Ukraine has really devastated the Black Sea Fleet, and it's interesting to read. Zelensky says that newly delivered NASAMS systems are entering service in Ukraine, and whatever systems come online, the stronger Ukraine becomes over time. And there's almost a curve where Ukraine keeps coming stronger and Russia is degrading because they're running out of stuff and they can't really replenish it very well. Okay, first Ukrainian armor crosses the Dnipro River. That was big because they're getting this beachhead across the Dnipro where it's lightly defended, and it's creating a real dilemma for the Russians, who are spread out all across the front line. Chuck Schumer, this is in the United States, the majority leader in the Senate. Chuck Schumer encourages Democrats to more forcefully push the Senate GOP on Ukraine aid. Now, there's going to be a conflict here between the GOP and the Democrats. The GOP is the grand old party. It means the Republicans. And between these two parties about how to go about doing this. I think they can come to a compromise. I believe they will come to a compromise, but it's still a pretty significant struggle to get this sorted out. And it looks bad. Like, we should all be supporting Ukraine. I'm a conservative. I don't think that it's going to be an easy process, but I think it'll be one that they'll work out. The U.S. says that Russia funds Latin America-wide anti-Ukraine disinformation drive. Okay, the way that they're doing this article is really interesting because what they're doing is they're trying to seed Russian propaganda through local outlets. It's somewhat like what you see on YouTube when RT says one thing and then that's picked up by Redacted and Jackson Hinkle and Doug McGregor and Scott Ritter and others. It's the same kind of thing, but they're actually targeting Latin American media outlets. Okay, Wednesday, November 8th, 2023. The main version of the assistant's death is an accident, according to the SBI. So there were multiple rumors about how this might have been, but they're saying that officially, as far as they can tell, it was an accident. Okay, Russia-Ukraine war. Current U.S. funds for Ukraine are 96% depleted, says White House. This is according to the Guardian newspaper. Yeah, so they need to create another funding bill soon, and they're kind of running down. European Commission recommends that Ukraine and Moldova begin EU accession talks. I did a video about this, very important. It's not done, it's not set in stone, but it's moving the right direction. And this is another piece in the puzzle moving toward integration into Europe. It'll probably be a couple of years, but they're moving there very, very rapidly. Key findings of the 2023 report, I looked that up as well. This is from the European Commission. Is this the beginning of the end of the war in Ukraine? Says responsiblestatecraft.org. Now, I read this article, and it was just a rehash with spin of the worst parts of the Time magazine hit piece from last week. But that's being put out there as, see, Ukraine can't win. See how what a bad leader Zelensky is, and how like it just was trying to magnify all those points. It's really unfortunate to see. Investigation. Russia violates promises of pay, pardons for contract soldiers. This is nothing new. They've been doing this for a long time. Ukrainian POWs are being sent to fight their own army, a Russian news claims. And so there's this Ukrainian unit fighting for Russia of people that somehow volunteered. I don't know the details of it, I don't know how large it is, but that's pretty terrible to be using former POWs in that way. But if they truly volunteered, they're terrible. And if it's behind, like if it's coercion that's behind this, that is a war crime. Okay, Thursday, November 9th, 2023, Zelensky holds a phone talk with the president of Paraguay. Now, I've seen in recent weeks how he's been reaching out to all kinds of countries that you wouldn't even think about in Latin America or Africa, because he's trying to build a larger coalition, and I think that's a good thing for him to be doing. Overextended Russian military struggles to maintain border defenses, say the UK, the UK Ministry of Defense, and that's right. That's where they are. They're overtaxed, and at the same time, they're saying, "See how many people we have in our army? We're so huge." But they can't really diffuse. Okay, so the Ukrainians keep presenting more and more problems that are spreading them thin, and that's, I think, the Ukrainian strategy. Burning bridges, isolated and diminished scientists in Russia struggle in a world transformed by the war in Ukraine. Now, this was from Science magazine, not something I normally read, but it's interesting how isolated even Russian scientists are as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. Russia says that Ukraine's EU membership hardly real possibility. So Russia's saying it's not actually going to happen. There's going to be no chance that they're actually going to integrate into the European Union. But remember, that's what set off Putin in the first place, was closer integration to Europe in 2014, which kicked off the Maidan revolution when the president then decided he wasn't going to go that direction. Okay, Czech President Pavel hints at negotiations as Ukraine can't achieve an advantage in the war. And so maybe he's tottering, just like Hungary is against Ukraine, and it looks like Slovakia is more and more against it. Maybe the Czech president is kind of leaning that direction. When Russia takes Odessa, Ukraine will disintegrate speedily. Now, this was in Pravda, Russia's Pravda magazine, but they're openly talking about taking Odessa. Like, this is, they're not planning on just stopping here. They want to go and go all the way to Moldova and then be able to link up with Transnistria. So it's no secret. They're not hiding it. Okay, Tuesday, conservative hopeful Nikki Haley slams isolationist rival over opposition to vital Ukraine aid. So if you watched the Republican debate, you saw Vivek Ramaswamy talk about how he's, cozying up to some kind of peace plan with the Russians, and Nikki Haley opposing it. Nikki Haley is probably the most hawkish of the Republican primary contenders. Donald Trump is clearly, I can make a deal and it's not going to be a problem and we can get this sorted out. But that's, of course, trying to give away Ukrainian land. Nikki Haley is probably going to have my vote when the primary comes around, because she's the most hawkish pro-Ukraine candidate on the stage. Okay, Ukraine sees NATO air technology as a key to breakthrough on the ground. Yeah, I mean, they really do need new technology. And frankly, in Ukraine's defense, a slow counteroffensive, the United States never would have tried to do what Ukraine tried to do with this counteroffensive. They would demand that they had the superior air defense in order to try to prosecute the war going across those lines. The number of Russian army recruits in 2023 revealed, says RT. And I did an entire video on this where Medvedev was crowing about, actually not an entire video, it was one of the 3 days or 3 big stories videos. Medvedev was crowing about how 410,000 soldiers entered the army last year. Well, that's maybe 150,000 more than there were in the previous years, 100 to 150,000 depending on the year over the last decade. So it's more, but we didn't factor in the Ukrainians taking 300,000 off the battlefield, so they're actually in a little worse shape than where they were before. Okay, Russian missile hits a Liberia-flagged ship in Odessa, Ukraine's main Black Sea port. Now, that's interesting because generally speaking, the Russians are trying not to tick off the African world. They're trying to make friends with them, but there's still these ships going through the corridors, and that's what I'm going to end with. Putin ally known as the Executioner was killed in Ukraine-planned car bombing. It was our operation. Ukraine took credit for that. I did an entire video about that. He was a bad guy. He's a political official who was Ukrainian, switched sides to the Russians, helped Putin take over Luhansk, and he's now no longer. Ukraine, Israel, can America support 2 wars and still handle China? I think so. But they have to be really careful, and they need more coalition partners, and they need those partners to really step up, particularly European partners who have been kind of depending on the United States for leadership. It's their backyard, and they really need to do that. And to the degree they do that, they take kind of the argument out of the populist Republicans argument that, hey, this isn't really our fight. They really do need to step up. And a number of these countries are stepping up in huge ways. I'm not going to denigrate that, especially the Baltic states and Poland. The per capita amount of spending that they've done there is really incredible. Okay, Friday, November 10th. Ukraine claims it hit 2 Russian landing craft in Crimea with sea drones. Wasn't a big operation, but they attacked by air and by sea simultaneously. The missiles apparently were shot down, but the sea drones got through and hit some landing craft. The landing craft had some armor on them, and so, yeah, I mean, without a navy, the Ukrainians are just continuing to devastate the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Ukraine to Putin. You cut our power and we will kneecap your biggest economic driver. And so what they're saying is, if you hit our electrical stations, we're coming after your oil and natural gas. And they have the capability, and they're growing the capability to do that. Interfax Ukraine, some 300,000 Ukrainian military have been trained ahead of schedule in the UK, according to Grant Shapps. Hungary's Orban says that talks on Ukraine's EU membership should never move forward. Okay, well, he's going to be the fly in the ointment. But there's another article, and that was in Radio for Europe. This was in Reuters, that the EU has a plan B if Hungary vetoes a $50 billion euro aid for Ukraine. They could do it by individual country and still get the stuff through. But yeah, the EU, the EU can be incredibly powerful, or it can be a minority. A single member can really sabotage or create havoc within the EU as far as aid to Ukraine. Stoltenberg warns of a long journey ahead in the Ukraine war, and I think what's important to understand, and I've pointed this out a couple times. Anders Puck-Nielsen talked about how the Russians immediately thought it was going to be a quick victory. About this time last year with Kharkiv and Kherson, the Ukrainians thought it was going to be a quick victory to liberate the country, and now we're all settling into it's going to be a long war. Speaker Mike Johnson floats confiscating Russian assets to fund the Ukraine war aid. It would be pure poetry, according to this article. Well, I don't know that that's actually a viable strategy. It's interesting. Republicans would like that because it's not coming out of our pockets. It would be coming out of Russian pockets, but I'm not sure it's entirely legal or possible. And so we'll see how that comes together. NATO member Romania says it's to buy 54 Abrams tanks from the United States for the Ukraine. And good on Romania. Okay, and that's it for Friday. Saturday, 1 year after liberation, Ukrainians in Kherson hold on to hope amid constant shelling. So remember, Kherson was liberated 1 year ago as of Saturday. And the tragedy there, and I could see it in Technicolor, was all the soldiers, or almost all the soldiers, got out. And those soldiers are just going to be redeployed. And they created that counteroffensive line, or the line that is now creating the havoc for the counteroffensive. And Servakin actually I mean, he looked very bad at the time, but he did more for Russia than pretty much anyone else by withdrawing those soldiers from land that they could not really hold and redeploying them. And it's unfortunate. I don't want to see that, but he properly gets kind of evil credit for being on the Russian side for actually doing that. And it's cost a lot of Ukrainian lives by being able to redeploy them. Yermak on the relationship between Zelensky and Zelensky. Love this line. We have one position, to win. Now, there's a lot in the media trying to stir up drama between Zelensky and Zelensky, and I don't know that there is something there, but even if there is, that's the right answer. We have one position, let's win the war. The Kremlin says, this is in Pravda, Ukraine will never be able to defeat Russia on the battlefield. Well, I mean, they kind of have in many ways, and so that's kind of a weird argument to make. But if they're talking about ultimately, I don't know that Russia could beat Ukraine either on the battlefield. So that's kind of an interesting, let's flip that and see how that works. Does it work the other way? Anyway, okay, Ukraine attempt to forge a bridgehead on the Dnipro River's east bank thwarted, says Moscow. According to The Guardian, Moscow has said that it's all been thwarted. I don't know. I'd keep an eye on this because I think this has great potential to actually spread and become something much more significant. Elon Musk was on Twitter saying, stop sending young Ukrainians to die. He said, quote, history will not look kindly, unquote, on those leaders who needlessly sacrificed their troops. And he was talking to Ukraine. What about Russia? Russia started this. They didn't need to do this, and they sacrificed 300,000 of their own. Zelensky on the anniversary of liberation of Kherson, Ukraine always returns. And that's the right answer. That's what they should be, the message that they should be sending, and they ought to be sending, and they are sending, and they're trying to live up to those promises. Ex-NATO chief proposes that Ukraine joins without Russia-occupied territories. I think that's a non-starter. He's an ex-chief. I don't think they want to lose their lands. I don't think they want to then try to get them back and embroil NATO in a war. I don't think that's going to go anywhere. Next article in The Guardian, as its counteroffensive stalls, Ukraine signals readiness for a long war. It is going to be a long war. We just have to get used to that idea. Ukraine military officer had a key role in Nord Stream sabotage, say reports. So there are multiple reports now that it was a Ukrainian special forces officer that had a small team that sabotaged the Nord Stream. At the time, I didn't think that was possible, that Ukraine had the tech to be able to do it. I didn't think the US would be willing to start a hot war with Russia. I thought it was probably Russia self-sabotaging in order to escalate. I don't know that this is right, but if it is right, and it could be right, then I was wrong. And I'm willing to admit if I was wrong. This is what the best understanding that we have is, and people have pushed back against me for having read that article or talked about that article the other day, but I'm not making stuff up. I'm just trying to report what is out there, what is known at this time. Borrell says that U.S. support for Ukraine will most likely decrease and the EU should be ready. And I think that's right. The EU should be ready to pick up whatever slack that they can, whether or not the U.S. support is increasing and or decreasing, and hopefully U.S. support will increase shortly. Border fight in the Senate raises risks. This is Sunday, November 12th. Border fight in the Senate raises risk for passage of Ukraine aid. So the Senate minority leader, Mitch McConnell, I'm reading a little bit, had been in lockstep with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, but tossed his support behind a border component in a bid to bring enough of his conference around to back the $105 billion supplemental. So you can look at this two ways. The first way is, oh, those Republicans, they're just trying to use Ukraine in order to get their stuff. Well, yeah, that is true. At the same time, you got to say, Democrats, how much do you really care about Ukraine? And if you do, give something here. That's their concern, so that you can get something there. That's how politics is done. And you can make this happen. Both of you can work together to make this kind of thing happen, and you should do it. Russia ramps up attacks on key cities in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine says resistance fighters, this is interesting, this was in Radio Free Europe, resistance fighters blew up Russian headquarters and occupied Melitopol, while Zelensky warns of a difficult war. Okay, so the blast, I'm reading now, the blast kills 3 Russian officers in an occupied town. Ukraine's intelligence says at least 3 Russian officers were killed at the Moscow-controlled Ukrainian city of Melitopol in a blast that Ukraine's intelligence said on Sunday was a, quote, act of revenge, unquote, by local resistance groups. And I think that's you're going to see more of that. Last couple articles, Ukraine's delegation is in the United States for talks, top Zelensky aide says. And finally, the 100th ship sails along the Black Sea humanitarian corridor, according to the ambassador to Ukraine. Remember, Russia pulled out of the deal, but they're still doing it in spite of the potential threat. So that's good that they're still getting things out. I might have missed something along the way, but hopefully the last almost 20 minutes that we spent together is going to help you understand what has happened over the last week in Ukraine. Thank you for the comments. I try to read as many as I can. The shares, the likes, the subscribes. Thank you for the coffees, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.